Hello, Sofa Squad. It always seems like we're learning some kind of obscure information or something just out of the ordinary with each of these cases that we look at. And the case today is no exception. In the trial that we're going to be covering today, not only are we going to be looking at a case that has no body, but also we're going to be learning about sludge ponds. Yes, I said it correctly. Sludge ponds. For whatever reason, images of Yoda and Star Wars are conjured up when I say that word, but it's far from it. In today's video, I'm going to be going over the trial. This was Wisconsin against James Prokopovitz, and the victim, the alleged victim, I should say, because there was never a body to 100% prove this, but regardless, her name was Victoria Prokopovitz. Then this was his wife, and she seemingly disappeared into thin air, although the state of Wisconsin seems to differ. We're going to be going over the parts of the trial, the case, that really stuck out to me, and kind of delving into that story. So let's go ahead and jump on in that sludge pond. The state is going to allege that James did away with his wife Victoria so that he could be with another woman. The state will allege that he disposed of her body in what has been called, in this case, a sludge pond. Basically, these are places where you get rid of waste. They're at a landfill, and it's a specific type of waste for a company that he worked for, and we'll talk about it in a minute. But essentially, the materials that are going into these things are corrosive, and it is alleged that, if a body went in there, there's no way you could find it, and it would basically, decompose the body at an accelerated rate. Now, the charges that James is going to face in this trial are some hefty ones. First-degree intentional homicide with a domestic abuse modifier, obstructing police, conspiracy to commit perjury, and perjury. On April 25th, 2013, Victoria Prokopovitz disappeared from her home that she shared with her husband James. They lived on Knesh Road in the town of Pittsfield, Wisconsin. Now, the next day, James would contact the sheriff's department to say that, she's missing. In this phone call, he would talk about Victoria's depression, some of her suicide attempts in the past, and he would state that he was fearful of her having taken her life somewhere near their home. Now, James would tell the investigators that the last time he saw his wife was at 10 p.m. the night before, and that's when he went to bed. That was the last time that he saw her. Now, he would also say that when he realized that she was missing, kind of like he popped up and he was like, oh my God, she's missing. He went out to search for her. Now, he would also tell them, she left behind her cell phone, her purse, her cigarettes, her identification. So key things that most people aren't going to leave behind. I don't know about y'all. Let's sidebar this for 1 second. I used to be a smoker many years ago. I can assure you, I wasn't going nowhere without the cigarettes. Especially if I was going to go take my last walk somewhere, you damn straight I was going to smoke one before that. But enough about me, let's continue. Now, here's where things start to take a turn for the, that seems kind of sus. April 26th, James goes to work. And during this trial, we're going to hear from the vice president of his company, coworkers, people like that. He doesn't tell anybody that his wife is missing. He just goes to work and acts totally normal. So that doesn't really pass the vibe check as far as I'm concerned. Now, also, we'll learn that even though James is telling authorities, look, I think she took her life, this is what I think, massive searches were done with dogs, you name it, all around this property. Now, when it comes to those searches that did take place, family and loved ones and people like that would all help, except for James. And not only did he not really assist in these, but people had something to say about his behavior during this. And we're going to hear this on the stand from multiple people. We're going to hear that he became hostile towards people over these searches, that he would just sit in his recliner and crack a beer at 7 in the morning, that he would be like, she's dead, don't bother looking. Stuff like that. And again, it's that's, doesn't pass the vibe check. Okay, now if that wasn't enough already, soon after she goes missing, we have another kink in this whole storyline. James gets with another woman. Now, her name is Kathy Friday, and she will become very prevalent in this case, and she too will also lose her life, which we'll talk about later. Now, when their relationship actually began is going to be a huge point of interest in this case for the state, for the defense, because the state is basically alleging this is the third wheel. This is the woman that caused James to take out his wife. And so there's discrepancies back and forth, yada yada yada, different testimony as to when they really met and how that relationship formed, even including from James and Kathy themselves. Now, records are going to show that yes, there is financial problems, there's unpaid bills, there's foreclosure. Now, also during these investigations, there's going to be even more interesting tea, and that is going to be in regards to like insurance and stuff like that. They would learn that very soon after this went down, James took Victoria off of his family medical and dental insurance plans within like months of this happening. So that never looks really that good, because that's kind of like okay, you kind of wrote that off. Now, we're also going to hear throughout this that yes, James even does admit that he did have access to that sludge pond that the state is for sure is where Victoria is at. And he's going to talk about, his access to it, the security of the place, and kind of his daily routine of that. And we'll also hear from his coworkers about that too. Now, when something like this takes place and the body's missing, the whole 9 yards, but there's a little bit of they would eventually hold a John Doe hearing. Now, a John Doe investigation is a legal proceeding in the state of Wisconsin that is governed by the Wisconsin Statute Section 968.26. A John Doe investigation is similar to a grand jury investigation. However, in the case of the John Doe, there is no jury appears, but rather the case is strictly overseen by the judge. Now, this John Doe hearing didn't go well for James and Kathy. In fact, one of the things that he said during this was, if I could ship my wife's body out in order to protect Kathy, I would. As you can imagine, that didn't go over too well. Now, other discrepancies would come out during this. For example, James has said, I went to bed at 10 p.m. the night before she went missing, or the night of, whatever. And they would find that actually, that bed was meticulously made. There was no signs of him actually sleeping in it. But during this John Doe hearing, he changed his story and he was like, oh, no. I actually slept in the living room. I forgot about that. Now, also, the investigators would question James like, okay, you were very panicked. You woke up. You're like, oh my God, where's my wife? So tell us what direction you went in. Tell us about that. In the trial, they would show videotape of him going along for a ride along with the police and showing them this route. Now, he would take them on this, but when they went and pulled surveillance camera from like gas stations and stuff, there was never any sign of his car during the times that he said he was doing this. Now, James also made claims that, I was calling her, I was blowing her phone up, I was trying to get a hold of her. But when they went and looked at phone records, it's like, nope, her phone was not blowing up. Now, James would also say, she had tried to take her life several times. These were not really documented instances, but we'll even hear from her own children talking about that. So I do think that there is some form of validity, but we'll also hear from her psychiatrist who had some opinions on that as well. Now, after this John Doe hearing, he was taken down to the sheriff's department for interview, and it's during this that he drops some pretty big bombshell information. He tells them, while under oath, I have been lying for years about my relationship with Kathy, and I was doing that to try and protect my relationship with her, and she has been lying as well. We both concocted the story because we didn't want to be transparent about our relationship and how long it's been and when it started. Now, sadly, it's that right there, this perjury situation, that is going to end up really getting Kathy, and she would end up having to cop to that, and before she could actually get sentenced for it, she would take her own life. Now, this is what James had to say about this. I did not kill my wife Vicky, but I did lie to police for years in connection with the investigation surrounding her disappearance. Ultimately, I lied in court today as well while I was under oath. I understand that lying to the police and the court was wrong and the illegal thing to do, but I did not kill my wife. I lied because Kathy and I were trying to keep our story straight. So that doesn't look good either. There's a whole bunch of this doesn't look good in this case. Now, at one point during some of these interrogations and these questionings and whatnot, James confessed, and it was more like a, oh, right, dagnabbit, well, I did it type of situation. And then he would also roll that back and be like, I didn't mean that. I was frustrated. So on and so forth. So that part I can understand, because we've seen countless times of these where the police are interrogating someone. Let's not even talk about if the person's guilty, not guilty, whatever, because we know there's lots of people who admit to guilt who did not do it. It was proved later they didn't do it, but they were kind of coerced into it. So with him saying I did it out of frustration, I think personally, whether he did it or not, he definitely did that confession out of frustration because it was just like, what else do you want me to do? So here's the thing. Over these years since she's been missing, there's been like no sign of this woman. No bank accounts, no hospital stays, no nothing. It's like she completely disappeared into thin air. So that's a little bit of an overview of what took place. So let's talk about some actual parts of the trial that really stuck out to me. And we're going to start with the opening statements. Now this case is very circumstantial, a lot of witness testimony, that kind of thing. You know, obviously there is no body in it. So it makes it a little bit of a steep hill to climb, but nonetheless, I felt like both the state and the defense really brought some interesting points to the table. So in the opening statements, the DA is going to outline some of what they're going to say is like, you know, very suspicious behavior on James's part. He would talk about how James went to work like nothing happened. He would talk about some of these statements that James would make to the kids, like her kids, his kids, you know, things like, oh, the power bill is really low right now, or you need to come get a U-Haul and get your mom's stuff out of here, and don't bother looking for her, she's not coming back, things like this. This is just not things you would typically say. Even if you're totally over somebody and you're just like, I am done, I don't care if they come back, you typically don't want to say this stuff out loud, even if you were thinking it. It's also mentioned how he went to help these searches and he was hostile towards some of the volunteers and whatnot, and how his help that he gave was sitting in the recliner and cracking a beer at 7 in the morning. Now they'd also talk about the relationship that James had with Victoria, and how there was some contention in that. One of the things they were talking about is at one point James told one of the investigators, if you lived with this damn woman for 20 some years, you know what I'm talking about. You know what we've been through. The DA would also talk about how James was controlling and abusive, how he controlled money and her medications. The DA also would foreshadow a little bit with what the psychiatrist was going to be talking about, which was, you know, a lot of the conversation between he and Victoria was about her abusive husband, James. He would also talk about how he took her off the insurance, you know, switched his insurance policies around. And then of course he's going to talk about the situation, the relationship with Kathy Friday, and how they both created these stories to hide it. Now also there are confidential informants, there's jailhouse informants in this, and the state will outline some of that, specifically with, you know, one of the jailhouse people, informants, and how they said that James was 100% sure that, you know, she was never coming back and that she was dead and all this stuff. And finally the state will outline how physically she just wasn't in a situation to walk away from the house like that, you know, and even if she was gonna like walk away from the house, she would not have got far. And they talk about how she left all these personal things and the car behind. So it's kind of like, where did she go if that's what she did? Now the defense really held their own during parts of this trial. Again, because this is largely a circumstantial case, the defense is going to have a lot of room to wiggle, you know, with the state having to prove everything. So these are the things that the defense talked about in their opening statements. The defense would counter all the things that the state said, and the defense is like, look, this is the behavior of a man that's concerned about his wife. The defense says that James is telling the family members and friends and stuff, you know, that they were never going to find her because there was already professional people out there searching. So it was more like there's already people searching for her, they're not finding her, you're not going to find her. The defense would also say that Victoria's family doesn't like the way his client grieves. And the defense would remind the jurors, remember, this is still a missing person case. You know, we don't have any proof that she's dead. Now, in regards to the aspect of James controlling the medication, the defense is like, yeah, he did, because he was controlling them because he wanted to make sure she didn't take too many. Now, Victoria, as we've already discussed, you know, she had these mental health issues, suicide attempts, so on and so forth. And the defense will say, look, the last time she tried to take her life, she told her family and everyone, next time you're not going to find me. So those words are going to haunt this trial. And the defense will finally say, James wants to know where his wife is too. Brown County Deputy Christine Bilgo would be the first person to testify in the trial. Christine went to the home after the missing persons call was put in. She went in there to go, you know, just see what was going on and get some information. Now, she did say that James was very calm. He just, you know, waited for her to ask the questions. There was no real panic. She did say that he had mentioned that one of her heeled boots was missing, which she thought was weird since, you know, Victoria had allegedly gone outside for a walk. Now, she would also say that she didn't really see any signs of a struggle at the home. Now, a very interesting witness that got up there was Stacy Deer. Now, this is Victoria's daughter. Now, Stacy would talk about several things during this testimony. She would talk about infidelity on James's part, which, you know, didn't help her mother's depression. She would talk about their money issues, James's over drinking, so she wasn't painting a real cute picture. Now, she would be one of the ones that talked about all of these searches that went on, all the people, and how James did not help, how he kicked back, cracked a cool one, the whole 9 yards. Stacy would say that about 3 months after her mother disappeared, James told her about having dinner with Kathy Friday. She would also testify about how James discussed canceling Victoria's health insurance. Now, Stacy would talk about her mother's past suicide attempts and how her mother had left notes on the other ones, but how she didn't leave any note this time when she disappeared. Now, another person who offered a very interesting perspective on life at their household was Wesley Edges, Victoria's son. Now, he was living with them at the time of her disappearance. He described his mother as not only, his mother, but also as a best friend. He would testify that he had a good relationship with James. He even called him dad. And you would hear this, like how these kids and stuff like that, they all looked at him as like, that's her dad. And so I thought that part was really interesting. Now, Wesley would also talk about his mother's previous suicide attempts during his time on the stand. He would talk about a time in 2002 where he found his mother on the floor with like a bunch of pills and how she was in the process of writing a suicide note. Now, he would testify about a surgery that his mother had for colon cancer and how she had to use a colostomy bag. Now, later she would have a surgery that reversed that, but nonetheless, all of this plays into kind of where her health was at, where her capabilities of being able to walk a long ways, because he did say that his mother had to use a cane to kind of get around. Wesley would also talk about how his mother did not leave the house that often, how she was no longer driving, didn't have a car, and how also that James did control the medication and money and stuff like that. Now, Wesley would say that hours before she disappeared, that James and Victoria had driven to a doctor's appointment. And Wesley was like, you know what? She was in the best mood that I've seen her in a while. She did her hair, makeup. She was just generally doing really well, which clearly that's kind of playing into the fact of, well, she's so happy, why was she going to allegedly take her life a few hours later? Now, on the day of her disappearance, Wesley was like, I had dinner with him. We all sat at the dinner table and ate. And he would talk about an argument that James and Victoria had, and it was over a tablecloth. Basically, she wanted to get some tablecloth from the dollar store, and James was like, I ain't having it. I ain't going to the damn dollar store. So it caused this argument. Now, that will become prevalent because we'll hear James kind of change the story on that and be like, what argument? What are you talking about? Type situation later on. Now, Wesley said that he left the house around like 6:30 p.m. and that was the last time that he ever saw his mother. Now, some people might be thinking at this point, well, what about Wesley? What did he do? Does he have an alibi? Well, he does, and I'm going to tell you what it is. So Wesley would leave the house, and he said he went over to some friend's house to help them with a computer, and he stayed there till about midnight. Now, he would leave out some information about what took place next initially, and I'll tell you why. Now, he would say that he met up with another friend and that, he stopped at some donut shop or whatever at 4 a.m. and then came home. Now, he wasn't too forthcoming with that second friend visit at first because guess why? He was buying some marijuana. For me personally, I was like, dude, when you told me you stopped at the damn gas station at 4 a.m. for donuts, I already knew that part. Okay, there wasn't computers going on. There was some of that devil grass going on. Regardless, though, when Wesley says that he got home, James pulled in front of him. And, he was kind of like, okay, what's going on? And James is like, Mom's gone. And Wesley's like, what are you talking about? And James is just like, I woke up. She's not here. Now, James would say that he had been out looking for his mother and he was going to continue to do so. Now, Wesley decided to stay back at the house and hang tight there, I guess, in case she came home or something like that. Now, Wesley was like, should we call the police? And James was like, I'm going to call the police, just not right now. Now, Wesley would say that James left and was back in 15 minutes. Now, originally, James would say that him and Wesley were both out searching. So, minor detail, but nonetheless, it's a little bit of a discrepancy. Now, while on the stand, Wesley would testify. He's like, look, it's not normal for Mom to leave the house for long periods of time, especially at nighttime. And he was like, besides that, she hasn't been taking these walks because of her mobility issues, because of her health issues. Now, the defense is like, well, look, she was known for taking walks walks at nighttime. And Wesley's like, cha, maybe at some point, but not at the time of her disappearance. Now, Wesley will say that he went up to his room and he hears James leave for work around like 5 a.m. And then James will come back home, obviously, later from work that day. Now, Wesley would say that he never took part in these searches either because it was like too emotionally hard for him, but he was happy that his sisters were able to organize this and do that. Now, Wesley also will say, you know what, Mom was a heavy smoker. She wouldn't even leave a room without her cigarettes. And she would never leave her purse. Now, Wesley too would say, yeah, you know what, there's a search team that refused to return because of how James was acting. Now, here's the thing. Investigators were able to, cross Wesley off as a suspect. Number one, they found photos with timestamps on his phone that corroborated his alibi, and also there would be witness testimony from somebody later on corroborating this alibi. Now, the defense would also question Wesley and bring out some other interesting points. Now, the defense does establish that, you know what, yeah, we had a good relationship with James. Also that, yes, you know what, my mother did have some up and downs with her mental health. Yes, she did have these suicide attempts in the past, but Wesley would say, I don't think she was suicidal at the time of her disappearance. Now, the defense will try and tear apart Wesley's timeline. And they're like, look, we went to that gas station, we went to that donut trap, and we saw that you were there at like 4:08 or something, which would mean you were home later than that. Come on. And Wesley will say, you know what, she wasn't struggling with depression and stuff when she was, disappeared at this time. He was like, the last time that I can really remember her being like depressed was back in 2012 over the colon cancer. Now, Wesley would say that, yeah, even though she was having these health and mobility issues, once she had that reversal of the colostomy bag, she started using her cane less and less. So she was becoming, more mobile, but he still stands by the fact of, look, she's not going to go for a 10-mile hike at nighttime. Now, Wesley would also have to admit that, yeah, he was totally hitting Mary Jane before he came home that night. And so, of course, the defense is like, well, do you think this could have slightly distorted your timeline? Now, remember how I said that James went to work and he was totally like, hey guys, what's up? Just clocking in here. Nothing abnormal over here. Well, the next witness on the stand is the vice president of the company that he worked for. That company is called McKeefreys, and that gentleman's name is Michael Chu. So Michael will get up here and talk about this whole elusive sludge pond thing. And basically what he describes his job as is hauling ash and sludge from a paper mill to one of these ponds. Now, these ponds are at a landfill across from the Austin Strobel International Airport. And he would testify that James was one of the people that loaded the trucks that took the stuff over there. Now, while he was on the stand, he would confirm that, yes, McKeefreys owns stone quarries, sand pits. Yes, the employees have access to these. I'm not 100% aware of, anyone accessing these after hours or anything. Now, they would talk about James's time card on April 26th, that next day. And Michael Chu was like, look, his time card, it's like 5:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. He's like, I talked to him that day, but nothing was really out of the normal. And I don't remember him taking any time off in those days after Victoria's disappearance. Now, when the defense would question him, the defense was like, well, what kind of relationship do you have with James? And he was like, it's just a working relationship. And so, we don't really talk about anything that deep. And he was like, yeah, you know what? James has never spoken to him about his wife's, mental health or anything like that, but he had heard stories from other people. Now, another family member, another child, in fact, the eldest daughter of Victoria's, gets on the stand, and she has some very interesting tea too. Her name is Marcia Loritz, and she's an advocate for the families of missing persons. Now, she would talk about all these searches that she helped organize. She would talk about, the various forms of things that they use, which is a helicopter, dogs, you name it, it was used searching for her mother. Now, she would talk about her mother's, past mental health issues, and she would talk about the help that she sought, through psychiatrists and whatnot. And she would say that back in 1992, her mother was diagnosed with multiple personality disorder. She too would talk about when she was a teenager, she discovered her mother trying to kill herself in a car in the garage, I guess, trying to do the carbon monoxide thing. And that her and her other sister convinced her mother to get out of the car. Now, she's going to also talk about an event that when she talked about this, I was like, ugh. That just doesn't sound good. Now, she would say in 2012, 6 months before Victoria vanished, she was on her way there one time. Now, she says while en route that James called her and was like, look, you know, your mom's not feeling good, don't come over. Well, she was like, oh, of course I'm going to still go. And so she went. And she's like, when I got there, it was like, what is going on? When she got there, she said that her mother was on the bed, and she used the word limp to describe her mother. And she also said that there was some dried blood on her shirt. Now, she would say that James was frazzled, he was agitated, and that she was like, we need to call an ambulance. And he's like, we ain't calling no ambulance. And she was like, mom wasn't responding, she wasn't, you know, moving, she wasn't rolling her eyes, like nothing was going on with her. Now, apparently Marcia would end up leaving eventually with a promise from James of, look, if something doesn't happen, if she doesn't improve, whatever, you know, I'll take her to the hospital, I'll call an ambulance. Now, Marcia would talk about after her mother went missing that she received a phone call from her sister telling her about this. And so she called James to be like, what? You know, and he's like, well, she finally did it. And she's like, what are you talking about? So as you can see, this pattern basically coming from James from the very beginning is that, yep, she finally took her life. She finally took her life. She finally was successful, that type thing. Now, Marcia would describe 3 days after this, that this is when the searches, you know, they brought dogs to the house. They were doing all this stuff. And she would have an interesting story to tell about his behavior when she was there. She said when they got there, this is when James cracked a beer and it was like 7 o'clock in the morning. Now, she would say something just did not feel right in her stomach. And she said that when she was there, you know, this is when they find like her mother's purse, her dentures, cigarettes, stuff like that. And she's like, no way my mother would have ever left, even if it was her last hurrah, without these objects. Now, she would also say, you know what? James would have never married my mother if he had known that Kathy Friday was divorced and available. She would say on the stand, there was a day that we sat at the table and he was telling us how much money he was saving because the lights weren't on all the time, and that he had dropped her off his medical insurance. And then that was when he also shared with us that he had a lady friend. Now, when the defense questioned her, they would go down the rabbit hole in regards to the situation of her mother's incident where she showed up and she wasn't feeling well and something was wrong with her. And they're like, well, why didn't you call 911 yourself? And the defense is like, well, you said it frightened you enough to the point that you left. And she's like, it did frighten me. And she's like, you know, I left because he said that if she didn't wake up, he was going to call an ambulance. Now, in regards to Victoria's previous suicide attempts, the defense would ask, was she, you know, did she show behavior of this? Was she suicidal before the time leading up to these? And Marcia would have to say, no, she wasn't. Now, remember all the testimony that have come out from the children and whatnot about some of the behavior that we saw in regards to the day of the searches and whatnot. Well, they would bring up other people, friends and neighbors and people like that, who were witness to this or were on the receiving end of his negative behavior. Now, one of Marcia's friends, Julie Smith, would testify that, yeah, you know what, she went to help with the searches and that James never came out. He was inside sleeping on the recliner. Now, she would also say on another day she was dropping off supplies and she wasn't sure like where exactly the search site was, so she stopped at the house and James answered the door and he was like really short with her and really didn't want to be helpful to her and kind of just shushed her away. Now, a lady by the name of Rhonda would also testify. Now, she was Marcia's neighbor from several years ago. And she too would also say, you know what, I never saw him at any of the searches. Now, as far as James's place of employment goes, not only is the aspect of him not seeing anything about Victoria missing a issue at hand, but also it's being presented that a possible place that the body was disposed of is at one of these sludge ponds. Now, a gentleman by the name of Mark Blazer worked with James at McKeefrey's. They would haul this paper waste, or the sludge, if you will, from Georgia Pacific Mill to the landfill, which was near the airport. Mark Blazer hauled the dump truck, James loaded it. His testimony would go deep into like, what is this stuff in the sludge ponds? What are they made of? So on and so forth. It is a byproduct of paper and ash. Now, these ponds are at a specific place in the landfill. They're like their own little thing. And he would say, you know what? They're not really like ponds, like, you know, what we're thinking of, like I said earlier, like a little Yoda pond somewhere. He was like, they're more like big bowls. Now, the big question on the table is, could a body be put in there? And so when he specifically asked, what, if you put something in there, is it coming back out? So when he specifically asked if something went in there, could it no longer be seen at some point? And he will say it depends on how heavy it is as to whether it will sink or not. And he cites an example of a previous time where a piece of equipment accidentally rode over one of the ponds and that it got stuck, but it didn't sink. Now, another huge thing that he would testify about is this whole aspect of how you get in and out of this place. And he said that you had to have a swipe card to get in and out of here, and that there was not really heavy security cameras, stuff like that, and that James had one of the swipe cards. So yeah, he did have access to this place. Now, he too would say, you know what, we never really talked about our personal lives with one another. We didn't have that kind of relationship. Previously, he had made a statement, and this will be brought up too. And the statement was something to the effect of, he couldn't believe that, James wasn't, out searching for his wife or whatever the day after she went missing, and that if it was his wife, he would have been doing that. And I think a lot of people can probably agree with him on that. Now, y'all, this whole trial would also take another turn when the judge, bless his heart, apparently had fallen and hurt his ankle at one point. Now, this would delay things. They'd have to go on pause or whatever, and it would end up that, like, a backup judge, whatever you want to call it, would have to take over. Now, also, once they got the trial back going with this new judge, a juror was going to have to be excused because they were exhibiting cold-like symptoms. Now, remember, this is like, the middle of COVID here, so even if you sniffle a little much, it's like, what's wrong with you? Now, another aspect to this trial, and where the state will trip James up and whatnot and really come at him, is on recordings and interviews and statements and things like that. One such recording is between James and Sergeant Ehrenstein. Now, this was done when they showed up to kind of see what was going on with the missing persons case soon after this happened. Now, some of the things that are noteworthy here in this recording are as follows. At one point, the investigators asked James when he got to work, and he says, about 5:40 a.m., you can check that real easy, because I got a card to get in. Remember all that talk about the cards and having to get in and da-da-da-da-da? That would be a huge thing. And it was one of those parts of the trial where you're like, to be quite honest, because it was like, okay, well, the card has to do this and then to track the time and da-da-da-da-da-da. And you're just like, oh my God, obviously it is very important. But when you're watching as like a bystander or whatever, you're just like, oh my God, can we please fast forward? Now, also during this, when investigators are like, do you think she killed herself? And he's like, good God, I hope not. And they're basically like, what do you think is possible? And he's like, well, I guess, but I mean, things were going good. So he's not sounding during that time like, oh yeah, hands down, that's what happened. Now, while he will say during these recordings, yeah, we had our rough days and whatnot. And I mean, honestly, who doesn't in a relationship? He's like, no, we didn't have any arguments. And, she wasn't like giving her stuff away leading up to this, which usually can be a sign of somebody planning on, not being here anymore. Now, Sergeant Ehrenstein will also say no cab companies, jails, or hospitals had any contact with Victoria at the time of disappearance. He also would say that he found it very telling her contacts in her phone hadn't communicated with her in a number of years, in some instances over a decade, and her phone hadn't been used in a number of days before she disappeared. Now, in another video interview months after the disappearance, he's very defensive. He's slamming his hands down on the table, and totally different vibe. Totally different vibe at this point. Now, we'll discuss some more aspects of recorded interviews and things like that here in a bit. But before we get to that, let's talk about the psychiatrist that got up and testified. Now, this was Victoria's psychiatrist. His name was Dr. Ashraf Ahmed. And he had treated or worked with Victoria years previous to the trial. And he treated her for approximately 5 years. Now, those years ranged from 2007 to 2013. And when they began questioning him, he wanted to make it very clear. And he's like, look, I'm not going based on just my natural memory of this stuff. I'm going based on stuff that I have been read and notes and whatnot again. Which I thought that was very interesting. I can understand where it's been several years before, but I thought that was very interesting that he just wanted to be real clear right off the bat, like, look, I'm, using the cliff notes here, okay? Now, he would say she is a vulnerable person. She has been struggling with traumas since childhood. She deals with anxiety, mood disorders, and numerous things. Now, here's the thing that's really interesting with his testimony about her, is he would say, I didn't view her as a suicidal person at all. And then when they're like, okay, well, what do you call these past attempts? He's like, she's just trying to get attention. That's all that was. Number one, again, if we had patients and whatnot that had these suicidal ideations, we like, we have to report that. We have to get them help, whatever. And he's like, nothing she ever did rang that bell with him to the point of like, okay, this is for real with her. He said her main thing is, and the reason for these cries for attention was her frustration with her husband, who is obviously James, and his abusiveness and his controlling nature. And in fact, he would say the most thing that they talked about, the most talked about thing between him and Victoria was her abusive relationship with James. And so then when they dig a little bit deeper into the whole thing, like, okay, well, let's talk about what does she have to say about these suicide attempts. And he was like, she never called them suicide attempts. She was basically like, look, I was frustrated, I was confused, like I was just making a rash decision, but that's not what that was. And so then when the defense is like, okay, so you're sitting here saying, this abusive relationship with the husband, did you ever ask her, like, what is this? Why does she think he's abusive? He would say that she said that he was very dismissive of like her physical and mental things that were going on, and that he was very controlling with, money, medicine, doctors, you name it. Now, we would also hear from some, confidential jailhouse informant type people in this case. And, we always hear at the Sofa Squad, that kind of testimony is always just a little bit of a grain of salt, because you just never know. But what I found interesting about this particular jailhouse informant is that the story this guy was saying was so similar to what family members had said that James said. So to me, I was like, interesting, this might have some validity. Now, the jailhouse informant would say that he was incarcerated with James in 2019 and that he heard some really damning information from James. What might that information be, Paul? Well, I'm about to tell you. He said that James said that he knew Victoria was dead and that her body was never going to be found. Now, he also said that James gave him his girlfriend's phone number, so this would be Kathy Friday, and asked him to contact Kathy for him. God, that was so many for him and hims, and oh Lord. Now, the defense would bring up a good point here, and he was like, hello, isn't it normal if someone's been missing for 6 years to be like, yeah, they're never gonna find them? And the guy had to be like, yeah, I guess so. To me, that's kind of like a play on words, but also the tone, because there's a difference between being like, she's never coming back, they ain't never gonna find her, I know that for a fact. And then there's a difference between being like, psh, she's been gone for 6 years, they're not gonna find her. See what I'm saying? So that really depends, and only that informant will know that. We would also hear from a private investigator as well. His name's Larry Warwick, and when he takes a stand, they're going to review another audio recording of him, James Prokopovitz, and the children. Now, one question that the private investigator would ask is, well, what was her attitude like, Victoria's, like in the week leading up to this? And James was like, fine, I guess. It was up and down, up and down. Now, in this, James would say that he kept telling her, go to the doctor, go get it checked out. And she's like, I'm not going. And he was like, she was afraid of leaving the house. She had to coax her out of the house. And so this is obviously totally contradictory to what most people are saying in regards to him wanting to take her to the doctors, being controlling of that, so on and so forth. Now, there are several overall things in this interview that would end up contradicting past statements, and this is going to be a huge aspect that we'll see once the jury goes back out. They want some of these videotapes to be replayed back in these audio recordings, because this is where things don't add up. James said that he called Victoria on the way home to ask about getting chicken for dinner the night that she disappeared, but multiple investigators would testify that she received no phone calls. He would also change his story with the private investigator about whether he dispensed pills to Victoria or if she could even take them on her own. Remember the argument that Wesley said they had over the tablecloth? Well, this will be another thing where, James is like, what argument? There's no argument. Now, also what would come out between these different interviews and whatnot, remember how the bed was made and it wasn't made and all that kind of stuff? Well, officers testified the bed was totally made. So his whole thing of, I just popped up at 3:30 in the morning and was like, where's my wife? Nobody slept in that bed. Another aspect is that James said that he called her multiple times when he was looking for her, but again, phone records don't show any of that. Now, also in regards to phone records, they will show that he called Victoria from his work phone at 4:14 a.m., but he had told everybody that he was home at that point. Now, also when straight up asked, do you think that she was like, killed herself or whatever? And James is like, I hate to say it, but I think that was her intention. So you see how this kind of flip-flops a little bit. And this just seems to obviously be a recurring theme with a lot of his statements. Now, also in this, he'll tell the private investigator that he contacted Kathy Friday about like a month and a half after the disappearance of his wife. Now, in regards to that relationship, we would hear from one witness who, for me, I felt like she had some very bombshell type of testimony. And this would be Kathy Friday's daughter, Jennifer Friday. Now, as we've discussed throughout this video, a huge question about this case is, when did this relationship start? Was it before Victoria went missing or after? We're talking motive, we're talking intention, we're talking all that kind of stuff here. Now, Jennifer would say, you know what, yeah, there was a very secretive dynamic to my mother's relationship with James. And so at one point she finally confronts her mother to be like, who, what, when, and where. Now, Jennifer would say that she did confront her mother eventually about Victoria missing. And this is what her mother had to say about that. Her mother was like, look, Victoria's been suicidal in the past. And there's so many places where she could have gone and hidden and done this or whatever. And, you know, that hopefully a hunter or something would come across her remains at one point in time. Now, remember that Jennifer's mother, Kathy, would take her own life. Now, Jennifer would say that, you know, she went through all of her mother's stuff, trying to piece together a timeline to figure out, when did this relationship begin? And she would say that it seems like it started in the weeks after the disappearance. Now, when she was in the stand, she would break down and she would say, you know what, I personally feel like that the deterioration of my mother and I's relationship, as well as my mother's life, is 100% because she got hooked up with James. James would have some more not so great testimony coming from those in his past. Specifically, we're now going to speak on his ex-wife. Darlene Ingalls, who was a previous wife of James's, would take the stand and testify about his abusiveness with her. She would say that he was controlling and abusive during her time in a relationship with him, and that one time an argument ended up with him pointing a gun at her. Now, James's own daughter would take the stand as well. Now, her name is Lisa, and she would tell the jury that when she found out that Victoria was missing, she went right to the house to help with the searches, and that she had not learned of Victoria missing from her father. She would also testify when asked about, like, you know, what their money situation was and stuff like that, that James made the comment about, oh, the electric bill is so much lower now. Now, one thing that was interesting that she said, and this was in regards to her father's work, specifically when he was going to these sludge ponds to these drop-offs, is that he would always go before the other workers, like prep or whatever. So that kind of places him there, and some of the evidence does show that it seems like he was there way earlier than other people were, or he was doing something besides searching for the wife that morning. Now, another one of Kathy Friday's children, her son, would get up there and testify. Now, his testimony would be interesting, and it would also differ from his sister's testimony. He would say that when his mother talked to him about the relationship with James, that she indicated it began around January of 2013. Remember, Victoria went missing April of 2013. So Jason's testimony is putting this relationship at beginning beforehand. Now, however, when the defense would question him, they would bring out that the phone records show that the first contact was in May of 2013. So this gets very muddy in regards to that. Also taking the stand will be yet another investigator who will testify about the origins of this relationship. He will testify that both Kathy and James did lie in order to keep this relationship, its origins and whatnot, secret. Now, the investigator would say the original story was that James had run into Kathy at a casino and they just hit it off, and it was like, oh my God, I've been looking for you my whole life. He would sign off saying that they made plans, they met at a truck stop and got a motel room. It was a real classy first date, if you will. He would also state how both James and Kathy made this lie up and maintained it for years. Now, also with this investigator, and this is also being shown during this time, is video of this. And this is where the ride along took place, where James is like, you know, we're going on this little ride along to show where I went. But the gas station footage and whatnot would show that that too was a lie. Now, once the state finally rests their case, it is announced that James will not be testifying. And in fact, the defense will ask the judge for a directed verdict on that first-degree homicide charge. The defense will say that the state has not proved intent to kill, and that has to be there to get that charge. However, the judge would deny that motion. That was not going to happen with him. So let's talk about those closing statements. The state will go first, and they'll say, you know what? There's been a family grieving, there has been loss and whatnot, but there's one person who isn't grieving over this. They'll say, as a matter of fact, that that same person is someone who benefited from Victoria's disappearance. Now, the DA will say that James killed and hid Victoria, and that James had 6 hours to do so before the police arrived for the missing person aspect. And the DA will reiterate, there's no way that Victoria could have ever killed herself and covered it up to this degree. We would have found her. The DA will say a line that I think is really good. The truth is in the lies. Now, the state will hit on the sludge ponds again about the biodegradable stuff in there and how, if a person goes in there, they ain't coming back out. They'll also go back over the whole dynamic of the bed not being made. All these little inconsistencies, and also all the storyline that they're trying to present of, look, here is potentially what we think happened. And the state would also cite some of this testimony from like the ex-wife about the abusiveness and things of that nature. Now, the defense will also go over things they've been reiterating. The defense will say when somebody goes for a walk, they do so with a purpose. The defense will talk about her multiple suicide attempts, and they'll even say, remember back in 2003, where she said, the next time you're not going to find me. The defense will say she had 10 years to plot and plan and pull this off. The defense also says, you know what, the state's trying to use emotion to convict my client, and you can't do that. He says there's not a beginning, there's not a middle, and there's not an end. Now, the defense will say, you know what, she's had these suicide attempts, she's had these mental health issues. She took her own life. Why did she leave her purse and cigarettes and all this stuff in identification? Because she didn't want her body to be identified. And they'll say, Victoria had a plan and she executed it. Now, whether she disappeared or took her life, we don't know because there is no body. Now, the defense will also say something that I'm like, ugh, this usually doesn't go over too well. The defense cites the Victoria's children. He's like, I'm sure they're heartbroken now. I mean, anybody would. But the defense says that hindsight's always 20/20, and that it's really hard to look in the mirror and say, I wasn't there for my mother. Now, the defense also says that, okay, even if, James was controlling the medicine, she could have been hoarding pills and then walked away and overdosed. Again, the defense is going with nobody knows because there's no body. And finally, he will bring up that, these past suicide attempts, she never left a note, and she didn't this time either. Now, once the closing statements were done, the jury deliberates, and y'all, this would take a hot minute. They deliberated for like 11 hours on a Friday. They would ask a couple of different times to review other things. Some of these were audio recordings and interviews with investigators and police. They would ask to see 2 of the defendants' police interviews as well as the phone records. Now, in order to review some of that stuff again, they have to come back in the courtroom. So they would eventually adjourn and they would come back the next day, but they asked them, the court, to prepare certain things to be viewed. Now, of these things, one thing I found interesting is they wanted to see some of the video on James and Kathy talking about, the lie that they constructed. They also wanted to look at statement number 2 from the Jailhouse informant. Now, they would go for another full day of deliberations and they would finally come to a verdict. The jury would find James guilty on all charges. Now, for Victoria's family and children and loved ones, they feel like justice has finally been served. Now, here's the thing. A lot of people, I feel like, felt very different ways about this case. Many people were like, he's not guilty, there's no body, there's no this, there's no that. Other people were like, oh my God, it's so obvious, And then other people were like, I felt like he did it, but they didn't prove it. This was a very interesting case in that context, because a lot of times some of these cases, even if they do have bodies, people can get off on these things. And so, to me, the fact that there was no body with this wasn't as shocking as the amount of circumstantial evidence. I found one particular thing very interesting. Well, I shouldn't say that, multiple things, but the things that the jury wanted to see. The fact that Kathy and James were making such a huge story up to cover the tracks of this relationship I thought was very telling. I thought the phone records were very telling. And I thought that just the little statements of how he didn't seem to really be that interested in helping people search, and nor did he say anything to his coworkers. Now, does that make him guilty? I don't know. Who's to say on this one? I'm curious what y'all think. Drop it in the comments. Let me know if you thought he was guilty, not guilty, if you thought that justice was served in this. Now, if you want to see some of my other coverage on trials, I'm going to attach this to a playlist so you can keep watching them. Also, if you're into scary movie reviews or thriller reviews or anything like that, be sure to check out my other channel. I'll put a little screen of it up here, but there's also a link down in the description. I appreciate everybody watching, commenting, sharing, liking, the mods, the Patreons, the channel members, and all the viewers for making the Sofa Squad the place to be. Okay. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And until next time, I'll see you then.